now. Greetings again and welcome everyone to this Virtual Collectors Showcase. My name is Alex Ames. I live in Philadelphia, and I currently serve as Vice Chair of the Fellowship of American Bibliophilic Societies, better known to many of you as FABS. I have had the opportunity to correspond with all of you as you registered for this event, so it's a delight to see you virtually now at the program. I am joined today by William Butler, the president, the chair of FABS, as well as Jennifer Larson, our treasurer. I have not yet seen Ronald Smeltzer, our secretary, but I expect he will probably be here as well. It's such a pleasure and a delight to be able to welcome you to this virtual program. I thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. And just for fun, I would love to invite those of you in the audience to let us know in the chat box where you are dialing in from today. I know we have registrants from all across the country and indeed from around the world. So if you have the interest, please go ahead and share in the chat where you are joining us from. FABS, as many of you know from our communications and our other programs, is a federation of bibliophilic clubs. So it only made sense to us to sponsor an event like this in order to help build a sense of community among book collectors and enthusiasts from across the miles. We do see today's event as something of a pilot program for future virtual activities. And so we're excited both to be able to welcome you to this particular event, but also see this as an opportunity to learn more about what our community would like to see us offer in terms of online programming such as this. To learn more about FABS, please visit fabssocieties.org. The purpose of this showcase, as you all know, is to introduce you to distinguished collectors and their collections. We intentionally are highlighting collectors today from across the United States in our lineup, and I just want to say that I am deeply humbled by and grateful for the participation of our panelists today: Victoria Dailey, Jesse Erickson, Bill Fisher, David Allen Richards, and Rebecca Romney. I will introduce each of these collectors as their turn to present on the roster for the day comes up, but I know that we are truly in for a treat to have the opportunity to engage with these wonderful collectors and their collections. Allow me to say just a few words about how today's event will proceed. I've asked each of our panelists to speak for around 15 minutes about themselves, their collecting interests, and select items from their collections, which they will either show using their computer's webcams or via a brief slideshow presentation. In order to guarantee that each of our panelists receives their allotted amount of time, I'm going to ask that we save all questions and discussion for the end of the program after all panelists have concluded their presentations. Seeing as we're a pretty substantial group today, I'm going to ask that you enter any questions you have into the chat box, and then my colleague Jennifer and I will choose some questions to read aloud and present to our panelists. There's a chance, depending on how many questions we receive, that we won't necessarily get to all of them, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time today and wrap up the program not too long after our publicized finish time of 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. As I noted earlier, I am recording the program. We do hope to make it available online eventually. I ask that members of the audience remain muted throughout this event, just as you all know by this point in the pandemic, feedback loops and sound disruptions are a problem on Zoom. So I ask that you keep your microphone muted and be mindful if you do have your camera turned on. One of the things that I always try to do when I host public programs at the Rosenbach Museum and Library here in Philadelphia is to offer some bird's eye view summative points for program participants to consider. And I hope you won't mind if I do the same thing as a sort of a prelude as we enter into the showcase. Our presenters today represent a remarkably diverse array of geographies, scholarly interests, professional backgrounds, and areas of collecting focus. But that said, even simply from the preparatory conversations I've had with each of our panelists, I've been so inspired by a few traits that I think really unite them and the work that they do: intense intellectual curiosity, passion for and commitment to the work that they and their collections can do in the wider world of bibliophilia, book history, material texts, and so on, and an understanding of the vital importance of collecting to deepening and broadening our understandings of history, literature, and culture. I'm so excited to learn more about the collecting interests of each of our wonderful panelists. With that, we will go ahead and get started with the showcase. Our first panelist today is Victoria Dailey, who is a writer, curator, antiquarian bookseller, and collector, concentrating on two main areas of interest: the cultural history of Southern California from 1850 to 1950, and the cultural history of Paris from 1789 to 1889, with an emphasis on women and the role of prostitution in Parisian society. She is a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and is also a member of the Grolier Club and the Zamorano Club. Dailey is also deputy editor of the Book Collector. Welcome and thank you so much for being part of our showcase today, Ms. Dailey.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex, and thank you to everyone who's here, my fellow panelists and everyone else. But without wasting too much time, we don't have much. I'm going to get my PowerPoint going in 1 second. And hold on, here we go. Can everyone see that? Yes, everyone can see it. Okay, so I have two main areas of collecting, which are the cultural history of Paris, as Alex said, and the same for Los Angeles. And the reason, I don't know exactly why, but for me, those two cities are the alpha and omega of cities. They're completely opposite, but they're both perfect in their own ways. And I grew up in Los Angeles, so I know it well. I've spent a lot of time and I studied in Paris, so I know it pretty well. And books are the major focus of my life. So with those two cities and books, I have the perfect thing to collect. And I've been doing it for 20 or 30 years for each. So with that, we'll get going and you'll see, we'll take a little trip. First, we're going to go to Paris. We've all been confined during the pandemic. So we're going to take a trip to Paris and then we'll come back to Los Angeles. So I hope everyone enjoys the trip. We're also going to time travel because we're going to the 19th century. So first, I realized as I started studying Paris in the 19th century, which I'd done in college, it's been a long-term interest. I dealt in French books. And as I was going to Paris, I found a little book. It's, you'll see the little red book there. It is a dictionary of the nymphs, i.e. prostitutes at the Palais Royal. And it intrigued me. I found it sometime in the 80s. And I had seen many, many French books, but this was a first. I didn't really know what it meant. And I kept it for many years, but every time I went to Paris, I started looking for more things on prostitution because I thought this is big. Because I had originally realized that Paris runs on three things: nicotine, caffeine, and sugar. That seemed to me what made everyone go. And then I realized in the 19th century, it was also prostitution. So this little book is sort of the beginning of my endeavor in my collection of 19th century Paris. Then I discovered another book that is by Parent du Châtelet. You see it here in 2 volumes, which was the first scientific way to analyze prostitution, because prostitution was a major part of French culture. It's so unlike American culture in that the French accepted it and then they tried to regulate it and they said, prostitution is here, so we're going to deal with it. And they asked Parent du Châtelet, who's an engineer to start with. He originally cleaned the sewers of Paris. And they said, well, you cleaned up the sewers, why don't you tackle prostitutes? So he did. And he came out with this book that became the basis of much of 19th century art, called Everything. Everyone read that book because it was the first time prostitution was treated as a scientific study. So here's the book that started everything, the little dictionary. And it turns out I also did a lot of research on it, and formerly the author was unknown, but I discovered the author. I've written about it if anybody wants to read about it. It's in the Book Collector, and it's also on the Los Angeles Review of Books. But it's a bibliographical study. It's a study of prostitution, and I think it's quite interesting. And I also discovered that the Palais Royal was the center of prostitution in the 19th century. So this wasn't unusual to give a dictionary of the prostitutes at the Palais Royal. It was where they all were. And so here's a little look at it, and you can see the kind of information that the author gave. He gave a little bit of information on each woman, but it wasn't in any salacious way. It was fitting with what you would think of in 1826. Then here's the title page for the Parent du Châtelet. These are sort of the two books that set the pace for my collection. Okay. Then, because I came across so many words for prostitute, I had to make a poster because I like to use my collection to do other things, write about it. And in this case, I found there were at least 400 words in French for prostitute. So my collection has been very handy for doing a lot of other work outside of just collecting. Then here you see a typical book. There were many, many books on the subject, and some were illustrated. In this case, a fold-out hand-colored frontispiece showing a man trying for his friends to keep him away from the prostitutes in the Palais Royal, but they were unsuccessful. And you can see what the women are saying. They want him to come up and see them. Then I collect many things. I collect books, prints, photographs, many, many things. This is a book by Louis Huard, who wrote a book on the balls of Paris, which was a place where men and women could meet easily, including prostitutes. So all these books have a serious link to prostitution and women. And Huard wrote many books about Paris and the life that people led at the time, the almost low life. It's not, I'm very interested in low life, the interaction of men and women and how society arranged itself. And as I said, it was all arranged in prostitution. I also collect photographs. This is a photograph of one of the most notorious actresses and prostitutes. Her stage name was Regalboche, and she is supposed to be the first woman to ever dance the can-can. And Louis Huard was interested in her, and she wrote her memoirs, although he probably wrote it for her. And then she created a mania for the can-can, and then there was another artist did drawings of her in a lithographic portfolio, as you can see here. So Regalboche was one of the most popular prostitutes in the mid-19th century. Then we also have a full range of lithographs and images of prostitutes. And interestingly, they were always depicted where they lived. So they were known by the quarter in Paris, the arrondissement where they lived. So each arrondissement had a sort of different kind of feeling, a different kind of prostitute. And here's one of the most interesting images from the Boulevard Saint-Denis, which was also the real center of prostitution as well, other than the Palais Royal. Then here is a satire, because phrenology was very popular at the time, and you could supposedly read people's personalities by studying their heads. So this is a comical view of studying the head of a cocodette, one of the 400 words for prostitute. Then, as I say, it's such a wide subject. This is a book, an extra illustrated, unique copy of a book on the actresses of Paris, which is a kind of update of the dictionary from 1926. Things had improved since then. Technologically, photography had arrived. And so there were many carte de visite photographs here of the prostitutes. They were just as popular as well, the most popular really of any people. Actresses and prostitutes were celebrated, and they were in magazines and everywhere. And then someone took this book on the actresses and put 51 photographs of them in the book. So it's a real treasure for me. I love knowing about the prostitutes, how they lived, because there were so few opportunities for women at the time that I became so interested to see how many women had to become prostitutes, because the society was arranged to completely exclude women from everything except wives. They could become wives, and they could become, or prostitutes really. They were not permitted much education, and they just were not permitted to work except for low-level work. So it was a dilemma, but some women had to become prostitutes in order to survive. Here's a list. Here's a book about them. Well, it's not just prostitutes that I'm interested in, but just the whole dynamic of French 19th century culture. So I had to get the basis for most of it. The most shocking book I think ever written, which is the Marquis de Sade's Justine, which I don't know if you've read it, but it's, at first I was so shocked when I read it, but then it was so excessive that I thought, oh, it's funny. It's actually a comedy because it's so unrealistic, but it it encapsulates everything that was right and wrong about French culture of the 18th century, which is when it was written. But then it presaged the 19th century as well. But it's one of the mainstays of my collection. It's rare. There's just a couple of copies in the US, and I'm really happy to have it. But then the other side, almost again, the opposite of the Marquis de Sade, is Mary Wollstonecraft, because part of my collection, I like to see how cross-cultural were the currents at the time. So, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women is a hugely important book, but it was immediately translated into French, which I find very interesting. Because as much as we think the French Revolution was about rights, it was, but for men, women had no rights. It just really was, they were excluded. So Mary Wollstonecraft brought the importance of women into Paris and her translation. So I think it's a very important work. And of course, I have to have other important books translated into French. And of course, her daughter, Mary Shelley, wrote Frankenstein. So this is the first French edition of Frankenstein. Again, we tend to forget that the cross-channel connections were very strong, even though there had been the Napoleonic Wars, etc. The intellectual currents kept going back and forth. Now we're going to ease our way into Southern California with an orange crate label, which shows the Eiffel Tower, which might seem unusual, but everyone in Los Angeles at the time was progressive. They were interested in all kinds of new things, and some of those new things were oranges. This is a picture of what Los Angeles looked like just about the time the Eiffel Tower was built. So it is kind of surprising to understand that Los Angeles grew so rapidly in so short of time, which is part of what I love about it. It's just so refreshing and so different from any other place. But this is what Los Angeles looked like, some of the original adobe buildings, and some of them from the 18th century when Los Angeles was founded. And then within 30 years, it looked like this. It was a hustling, bustling city, and it just kept growing and growing. And so I collect all the manifestations of its growth, its transformation, its effort to promote itself. They discovered that if you just added some water, anything would grow, and it did. So that every little booklet has flowers and fruit, and it was so inviting. But then it took these two people, Helen Hunt Jackson and Charles Lummis, to develop the intellectual basis for Southern California. They both understood it, loved it, and promoted it in different ways. Helen Hunt Jackson tried to get redress for the wrongs done to the Native Americans here, and she couldn't get anywhere. Congress didn't listen, and she really tried to do something. So instead, she wrote a novel called Ramona, which became the foundational myth of Southern California. And along with her was Charles Lummis, who, both of them were from New England. He went to Harvard. He walked across the country to get here. writing newspaper dispatches, and then became the founder really of Los Angeles culture. He founded a magazine called Out West. It was originally called The Land of Sunshine. It was a promotional kind of magazine. He completely changed it. He published many of the original California writers, and he just deeply loved California and was really the major figure to give it uh, an intellectual framework. He was the one who understood the importance of the Spanish missions that were here. They were crumbling because most of the settlers here were Yankee Protestants or Midwestern Protestants, and they didn't really care much about the Catholic background of Southern California. And he was the first one to see, no, we have to save the missions. We have to encourage what is here and understand we're not descended from England. We're descended from Spain and Mexico. And that's part of what Ramona did as well. Then through Lummis and several others, they started to promote the city as a Mexican and Spanish town, and they started to have fiestas in the 1890s and advertise them in posters and many ways. And so I collect all of that, all the ways the first publicity was organized in Southern California. And even in this image, you can see all the images date from Ramona. They always show a lovely senorita, and that became the first California girl. Then back to oranges. Thousands of photographs were taken. People were encouraged to come here. The first navel orange trees were planted in Riverside by a woman, Eliza Tibbets, who deserves a lot more credit. She was a suffragette. She was an abolitionist. She was a friend of Frederick Douglass. She's an amazing person. She moved out here and was interested in agriculture and had 2 small navel orange trees from Brazil sent out, and the rest is history, as they say. But it was the orange groves that brought everyone here, and I collect everything about that as well, agriculture and the change, because there wasn't much here agriculturally at all. There was nothing. So it took pioneers to start to see what could be done here. And then apart from oranges, it was full of flower fields. And then there was a fiesta of flowers. I mean, it was amazing here. People said that when they took the train in, as soon as they came over the Cajon Pass, the fragrance of orange blossoms greeted them, and they knew they were in Southern California. It was so astonishing. And all of these events had fiestas and such, which the Rose Parade is the descendant of all of those earlier parades. Every city had a little specialty. This Redondo Beach was known for carnations, and every little place had its own little realm and reason for being. And here we see some of it. And then, as I said, every little town had its own hotel, its own concept of itself, its own landscaping. So I collect all these wonderful, beautifully printed. It's also the golden age of printing, the layout, the typography, everything about these brochures was intended to attract people, and they did. Then we're back. Helen Hunt Jackson not only wrote Ramona, she wrote lots of other books. She's a wonderful writer. In fact, in my opinion, Ramona is her worst book in terms of reading it, but she wrote children's books. This is about the life on Abbott Kinney's ranch. Abbott Kinney was a good friend of hers. He was another California founder. He founded Venice, as we'll see in a minute. But he had an amazing ranch in Sierra Madre. You see the picture. And she slightly changed the name of Kinaloa to Connerloa, but it's the extent of her interest in Southern California was vast, and she died just as Ramona was being published. She unfortunately didn't live too long. Then her friend Abbott Kinney is the person who founded Venice. And again, it's so typically Los Angeles, like, oh, let's make a city in imitation of Venice and we'll build canals. Yeah, good idea, let's do it. So they did. And it's still there, although some of the canals are drained, but the remnants of all these fanciful ideas are still here. And the legacy is is an unusual one. I don't know of any other place like Los Angeles. I don't think there is. Each little town has a legacy, and this is an unusual legacy. Then the legacy is even evident in sheet music, which I also collect if it relates to the subject. Here is the woman who was Miss Los Angeles. And she was the descendant of one of the original founders of Los Angeles. And again, this ties into the Ramona theme. She's yet another kind of Ramona figure. And the whole idea of incorporating the Mexican and Spanish past is a major thrust of Southern California and my collection. And also here you see at the top, it also emphasizes where flowers bloom in winter. So it was constantly promoted, and it's still true. Flowers still bloom here in winter. Then finally, we can't leave out Hollywood. For a long time, I was averse to collecting Hollywood. It just seemed to give the wrong idea about Los Angeles in many ways, because I was interested in pre-Hollywood. But then I realized, no, that's not the right attitude. I had to incorporate some Hollywood because it is so important, and it changed so much about what happened here. But so part of the collection is satires of Hollywood, as you can see these two books. So I have to include Hollywood in some way, and I'm glad I did. I think it was the right decision, but it's not, I don't really have a Hollywood collection. I have a Los Angeles novel collection in which satires of Hollywood exist. So that's my collection, or my two collections, and a little bit why I do it. There's, I think I have about 10,000 items. So I've given you a very, very tiny look at what I've been doing and why. And I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating glimpse into your large collection. I will remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions for Victoria Dailey, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, and we will get to them at the conclusion of our time together today. Our next showcase panelist is Jesse Erickson. Jesse R. Erickson is Associate Professor in the Department of English in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, and Coordinator of Special Collections and Digital Humanities at the University of Delaware's Library, Museums, and Press. His research focuses on ethnobibliography, alternative printing and non-canonical textuality, African American print culture, and the transnational printing history of Ouida, whose works he actively collects. I might also note that Jesse and I worked together on a digital exhibition about Alice Dunbar Nelson at the Rosenbach in 2020. Welcome, Dr. Erickson, and thank you so much for being a part of our program today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ames. And I have to say, you promoted me. I'm assistant professor in the Department of English, not associate professor, although I am an associate director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center. But I have a really long title, so things get mixed up sometimes. Anyhow, I'm very grateful, very, very grateful to the Fellowship of American Bibliophilic Societies and to Dr. Ames, of course, for the opportunity to share my collection with you all and with such an esteemed panel of collectors. Now, today is Father's Day, so I want to send a special shout out to all the fathers out there who are in the Zoom and who are out there doing their thing. I've been blessed with two little ones myself, Namazani and Nello, ages 2 and 4, and they are my greatest joy. But outside of being a dad, my other great passion in this world is reading, studying, and collecting the works of the Victorian period author Ouida. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about Ouida in a minute. But I want to begin by telling you a little bit more about myself and about my professional and research background first. So I'm somewhat new to the world of antiquarian books and book collecting. I earned my PhD in library and information studies in 2016, and I've been working as a special collections librarian and educator at the University of Delaware ever since. My background in special collection actually goes back to 2007, when I had my first internship at the Getty Center's Manuscripts Division, and I've been working in libraries since 2006, in a career that spanned every rung of the ladder up to this point, from intern to library clerk to library assistant to special collections librarian. Currently, I have the wonderful opportunity to teach courses that focus on primary source pedagogy and object-oriented learning at the University of Delaware's Department of English. And each semester, I'm tasked with building courses that make use of both the latest in digital scholarship and our rich, rare book and archival collections. I've taught courses, for example, on Victorian popular fiction and critical bibliography and the Black press using such collections as the Mark Samuel Slassner collection and the Alice Dunbar Nelson papers. Taking advantage of digital affordances of virtual reality and augmented reality technology for student assignments. So with a research background that started in descriptive and ethnobibliography and Black literary and print culture, how did I end up studying and collecting Ouida? It's a fascinating story, actually. So in 2012, I presented at a print networks conference in Leicester, England, on the subject of radical periodicals in the mid to late 20th century Black American press. Now, the editors of Publishing History at that time reached out to me with an offer to publish the piece in their journal. The next year, while I was preparing the article for publication, I started going through the journal's backlog of articles to get a better sense of the journal's intellectual history. And during my search, I came across Celia Phillips' 1978 article titled Under Two Flags, The Publishing History of a Bestseller. I remember thinking to myself, who's Ouida? And why have I never heard of her, especially if she's penned a bestseller? Because the article really took a detailed look at the sales history of one of Ouida's most famous novels. So after reading the article, I immediately Googled Ouida and I read her Wikipedia entry, and I found the brief summary of her biography to be extremely fascinating. I became even more curious about her work. Now, prior to that point, really actually from my adolescence, I had spent years reading chronologically through the works of the Western canon from Plato to Shakespeare. And having reached the 19th century and finishing up my reading of Jane Austen, I decided to give Under Two Flags a read. Reading that book literally changed the trajectory of my life. I should mention that I was also completing my research for my doctoral dissertation, which used ethnobibliography as a method for reassessing our understanding of African-American literacy practices in special collections libraries. My reading list for my dissertation was filled with books in cultural studies and Black studies, Black feminism, radical pedagogy, and African-American print culture that I read alongside 19th and 20th century Black authored fiction and poetry. But I was so taken by Ouida's novels that I binge read all 26 of her three-deckers by the time I had finished writing my dissertation. And not long into my postdoc, I finished reading virtually everything Ouida had published, with the exception of one of her privately printed shorter works and a couple of her essays. Still, we're talking about an oeuvre of over 50 books, including novels and novellas and short stories and essays. Now, Ouida, who was born Maria Louise Romney in St. Bury Edmonds and lived from 1839 to 1908, when she died from pneumonia in Viareggio, Italy, the country where she spent a large part of her working life. Now, she was an immensely popular and prolific writer of the 19th century who won the hearts of readers on both sides of the Atlantic and across Europe. She enjoyed a sizable amount of American fans, including Black readers, during the Victorian period. And she never married. And through her writing, she was able to provide for her mother and her many dogs, which she famously cared for with a zeal unusual for her time. And she was known for her various eccentricities, which provided constant fuel for the more sensational journalism of the period. And even though she made a fortune, she spent lavishly, which ultimately led her to dying in poverty after her popularity had waned with the rise of literary modernism. Ouida became my favorite writer after I finished reading Under Two Flags in 2013. The more I read from her, the more my fondness for her works would grow. There's something in her style and her narrative that I find absolutely uniquely suited to my proclivities. And to this day, her books have eclipsed all others. And she is my favorite novelist in terms of their ability to captivate me. I know that it is unusual for a Black reader to collect a Victorian period author like Ouida, but like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar loves Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, and like Jamaica Kincaid prides her set of Austen, I found ways to connect and celebrate my passion for Ouida's work through my Blackness and not apart from it. Because really, as a Black reader, I cannot separate the lens of my racial experience from my reception of her work. Now, this lens and the fact that I grew up in the hip hop generation has contributed to the many ways that I've been able to connect with Ouida as a writer, of everything from, her sensational Silver Fork novels of the aristocracy to her sentimental rustic stories of the peasantry. But it allows me to be able to engage with the complex issues of imperialism and xenophobia and racism that are present in many of her books in very sophisticated and nuanced ways. I really think it is important for readers and collectors alike to ask critical questions of themselves about why they are drawn to a particular author, genre, or body of work, especially if the books they prefer to read or collect are coming from outside the boundaries of their racial or cultural experience. Intellectual gentrification and cultural appropriation are factors we must contend with and probe in our practice. Now, that said, although my collection is still rather nascent, I've only been collecting for Ouida, between 7 and 8 years. I'm extremely dedicated to building one of history's great collections of Ouida. My collection is strongest in American First Edition, of which I own somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, including duplicates and with binding variants. My collection is weakest in British First Editions, of which I only own 3. But I've focused quite a bit of attention on cheap editions, unauthorized and pirated impressions, rogue copies, and periodical press works. For example, I was able to purchase her first published story, Dashwood's Drag, which was published in Bentley's Miscellany in 1859 for a comparatively low price. I also have several translations of her work in French and Spanish, Japanese, and Korean. Unlike many rare book collectors, I value heavily read copies in poor condition as much as my pristine copies in fine condition. And I especially love it when the books show evidence of the everyday readership of her books in circulation. And best of all, since she's become so obscure over time in the West, the majority of her books are comparatively affordable, which is a huge benefit to someone like me who doesn't come from money and is not a collector of considerable means. So now I'm going to turn on my other camera here so that I can show you some of my favorite items. So you can see here, I'll just wait for this to spotlight.
Give me one moment as I try to find, oh, there it is.
All right.
Okay, and spotlight for everyone.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Dr. Ames.
You're welcome.
So this is my latest acquisition. It is the first British edition of Fall for Rain. Now, this is my favorite novel of all time. And the protagonist is Romani, of Romani descent, half French, half Romani. And it's the most cathartic reading I've ever, enjoyed. That's specifically covers the topic of racial marginalization and being otherized. And it's just a really, really emotional book for me. The protagonist is abused and just treated horribly by the townsfolk in her quaint French village. And I just really, really love this book. This is one of the last books under the Chapman and Hall imprint, which would move to Chatto and Windus subsequently. And it's a 3-decker, and this is how most of her British first editions were published. And these are pretty hard to find these days, and they're one of the most expensive when they do come on the market. I also have this really marvelous Lippincott, which is a special edition of Under Two Flags. And this is one of her most famous books. It's been adapted into film several times, at least 4 by my count, between 1900 and 1936. And this is a special illustrated edition with illustrations by G. Montbard and EWA. And this is really special to me because it has a letter from the author tipped in. And I do have, several letters from Ouida in my collection. I collect correspondence and photographs and ephemera and all that sort of stuff. But this one has a letter that she wrote to the North American Review, which is one of the periodical presses that she published her essay work in. And it just really has really beautiful illustrations all throughout. And I love illustrated works by Ouida. They're some of my favorites, and that's why I tend to focus a lot on cheap editions and periodical press works, because they often contain more illustration. This is a Roycroft edition of A Dog of Flanders. Dog of Flanders is her most popular book, and it's most popular in Japan and Korea, where it is still extremely popular, and it's become almost canonical out in Japan after it was adapted into a Japanese animation version. But this book was really popular throughout the United States, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. And it has also been adapted into film and cartoons numerous times. And this is a Roycroft edition. So it's one of those rare circumstances where you find her work being printed in closer to the fine press tradition. And then lastly, because my time is up, I wanted to show this copy. It's a Lippincott first edition. Lippincott was her American publisher. And what's special about this book is it's signed by Becky London, who was Jack London's daughter, right? And Jack London credited this book, Signa, as being his inspiration to become a novelist. So that makes this book really special for me, because it's that really deep literary connection to the power of the literary afterlives of a particular author. And so, yeah, so that's what I have to show you today. My time is up, and I will move it on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Let me see if I can remove the spotlight there. Okay. Dr. Erickson, that was fascinating and wonderful insight into your collection. Again, just a reminder, as you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Okay, our next panelist who will present is Bill Fisher, who collects widely in the field of Latin American literature, including specific authors such as Pablo Neruda and many subfields relating to literary movements and publishing houses. He also collects Chicano movement material and Spanish language imprints from the US. He is a member of bibliophilic organizations, including the Grolier Club and the Book Club of Texas. Welcome, Mr. Fisher, and thank you so much for being a part of our showcase today.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to FABS leadership in general for putting on this event. Hopefully there will be many more to follow. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to give an overview of my collection. And I'll give a description of what I'm up to, but I'm going to spend a lot of my presentation talking about two acquisitions that are particularly representative of my collections, and also were made during COVID lockdown, just to show that yes, book collecting does go on despite events in the larger world. By way of background, I was a Spanish major in college, and I studied abroad in Chile. And when I got back, I started purposely collecting Latin American literature. I was very interested to hear Jesse's comment about, potential cognitive dissonance of being a Black man collecting a female Victorian author. Well, here I am, a white dude from Texas collecting Latin American literature, some in English, but largely in Spanish, when not other languages. I think collecting in general is a process of learning about the world and, not necessarily about yourself, learning different things about the world and different peoples. And so I find it rather natural, especially being so close to Latin America here in Texas. The oldest part of my collection is Latin American literature. Within that, I'm especially focused on poetry. I found that over time, books as objects, the poetry books are more interesting than the narrative books. Not always, but generally that's the case. And also at this later stage in my collecting, I certainly appreciate the fact that they take up less linear feet on the shelf. As Alex mentioned, my major author collection is Pablo Neruda, about whom I will say more shortly. I also have some country-specific concentrations, Chile because of my experience there, Mexico because of proximity and travels there, and Peru because my wife is from there. And then several sub-collections that don't have anything to do with authors or locations, but publishers and styles of books. I particularly like rustic books, and I have large collection of Ediciones Vigía. And I'll give a shout out to my Chilean dealer who's on the Zoom today. I really love Chilean books by Ediciones Mimbre, which were published in the 60s and have a lot of woodblock prints in them. So Alex, if you would go ahead and start up my presentation. I'm going to start with showing a Neruda book that I acquired earlier this year. Here it is. One of Neruda's most well-known books was this one, España en el Corazón, Spain in the Heart. It's a hymn to the glories of a people in war. First published in 1937, as shown here in the first edition. This is a searing collection of poems about the Spanish Civil War, and it marked a significant inflection point in Neruda's poetic career. For the first time, he embraced socially committed poetry, which became a constant in his later work. As a whole, the poems were an exhortation to support the Republican cause, alternately by praising the brave Republican soldiers and excoriating the nationalists. Neruda had used the same publisher for most of his career up until this point. There was a publisher called Ediciones Ercilla, which had been after him for a while to publish his complete works, and he finally acceded to their blandishments in return for A, a fat advance of royalties, and B, their agreement to publish this book first, because he had just written this during the Civil War and he really wanted it out there. The difference in style from his prior publisher was immediately apparent. Prior books were very well designed, but it was just text laid out on the page. This new book included numerous photo montages by a Chilean designer and childhood friend of Neruda named Pedro Olmos. That makes this a photo book, which means it has crossover interest. And practically speaking, from the perspective of a collector, it means we have more competition because it's not just the Neruda or the Latin American lit collectors who are after it. But competition is good. Let's go ahead to the second slide, please, Alex. The photo montages, as you will see, are on pages facing the text. And as with many photo poetry books, there is usually some semantic or thematic connection between the images and the text. Here, this is the opening poem in the poetry collection. It's called Invocation. And appropriately enough, we have a soldier here blasting his horn. It's not a happy fanfare to come and read nice love poetry. No, it's more of a call to arms to read these poems and really come to the defense of Spain. There's a lot more images. There's about 16 photo montages in total. Let's move to the next one, Alex. Many of them are about fighting or the aftermath of fighting. Here we've got soldiers in active combat. On the bottom, we've got people fighting in a city, and above we have fighting on the countryside. Now there's a lot of gruesome images, so I'll give you a trigger warning before asking Alex to move to the next one. There's a lot with dead people and dead babies. Go ahead, Alex. So there were a lot of photo books, not photo poetry books, but photo books done by the Republican side during the war to show the atrocities committed by the nationalist side. Many of them showed the aftermath of Guernica, and you'll have a lot of pictures of dead babies. What's different and interesting about this book is here you have the corpses of the dead children surrounding the face of a smiling Francisco Franco, who was there in the center. I find the disposition of this image within the book particularly interesting. The facing poem is not about Franco, it's about one of his co-conspirator generals. It's only on the following page that we find the poem to Franco, which is called General Franco in the Circles of Hell. So in my reading of this book, I see this image as the title page for the upcoming poem of Franco in the Circles of Hell. Okay, so bibliographically speaking, this first edition had 2,000 copies. Most of them were done on paper produced in Chile with very high wood pulp content, well designed at the time, but doesn't survive well over the years. However, there was a small run of 250 numbered and signed copies that were done on imported paper that have survived pretty well when you can find them. I've had a placeholder copy for a number of years with a perished spine and pretty beat up wraps, but I've been on the lookout for a new one. So one fine Friday evening earlier this year, I'm running my traps on a Mexican website that lists books for sale. And I'm running down the list of poetry books and Neruda books in particular that are for sale. And I see an image of the front wrap of this book in pretty nice shape. Well, that's worth a click through. I clicked and I saw that it was an inscription, a presentation copy, and I about fell out of my chair. Go ahead to the next image, please. The inscription was to Manuel Azaña. And for those of you not up to speed on your 20th century, early 20th century Spanish history, Azaña was the president of the Spanish Republic during the entire Civil War. The inscription reads, a don Manuel Azaña, honra y corazón de su pueblo, Pablo Neruda. To Don Manuel Azaña, honor and heart of his people, Pablo Neruda. And I just about fell out of my chair. This is about the best imaginable association copy of this title, unless Neruda sent one to Franco himself with a poison pen inscription. And if anyone ever sees that, please call me, because I'd love to get that. But still, I was jumping for joy at finding this one. Azaña, as I mentioned, was president during the entire Civil War. When the war was lost, he went in exile to France. The Franco regime successfully extradited a lot of the Spanish Republican leaders from France and managed to put them on trial and sentence them to jail, if not to death. Azaña escaped that fate due to a diplomatic maneuver pulled by his friends from Mexico, who declared the house where he was staying an annex to the Mexican embassy, and therefore he was on Mexican soil and protected. Well, they protected him from extradition, but not from death from poor health. He died very soon after arriving in France, and his widow and family moved to Mexico. Now, as the saying goes, every book has its fate, and this book had a curious fate. And I asked myself, how did it wind up in Mexico on its way to Texas eventually? Well, it presumably went with his widow, and then went from the widow to a nephew who died earlier during the COVID period, and out of whose estate I purchased this. Let's see. Yeah, you can go ahead to the next slide, please. So buying books from Latin America is a lot of fun. As I mentioned, I've got my main dealer from Chile on the line now. I have a number of dealers and scouts looking out for me, but then there's all these websites that are always listing interesting material, but it can be hard to buy it once you find it. There was actually a buy it now button on this website, which wouldn't work unless you were in Mexico. So I was pulling out my hair. I was making post-midnight calls to friends in Mexico to try to get it. And suffice it to say, it involved about a week of trying to figure out who the owner was and then get someone in person to his small town in rural Mexico to pay for it, get it, and ship it back to me. And when it was shipped back to me and I got it and I breathed my sigh of relief and happiness, first thing I did was flip it over to the back. I wanted to see what the book cost, because the dealer didn't say whether this was the special limited signed issue or not. I suspected it probably would be. I mean, if you're not going to give the limited issue to the president of Spain, who are you going to give it to? Well, I flipped it to the back, and sure enough, it was that issue. I could tell by the price. And then I opened it up, and I got another happy surprise. You'll see the machine stamping in the dead center of this issue, of this image. It was copy number 1. All right, Alex, you can go ahead and stop my show and go back to the regular camera. And then I do want to show, yes, I love high spots, but I love other stuff too. Here's the fancy limited edition. Here's a second edition. Notice the bulking. It's a whole lot trimmer. There was an issue, the second edition, that had no images. So this is a photo book with no photos. The reason was Neruda was very sensitive to attacks, especially from the left, about people who said, yes, you're writing socially committed poetry, but you're charging a lot of money for it and issuing it in this deluxe edition. This makes no sense. So I like the popular editions too. All right, with the remaining time that's left to me, I'm going to talk about another area of my collecting. I collect Chicano material from the 60s and 70s. Books, correspondence, manuscripts, occasional archives. And then most people on the Zoom call know about collection creep. I've gone forward in time. You have to use a different moniker of Latino or Latinx material, but also backward in time. I particularly like Spanish language materials printed in the US. I've done a lot with San Antonio imprints during the Mexican Revolution, but even back in the 19th century. So in honor of this Zoom call being put on by an institution out of Philadelphia, I've chosen an early 19th century imprint from Philadelphia. And I'm going to hold it up. This is called Xicotencatl. Philadelphia was a hotbed of Latin American exiles in the early 19th century. This was during the independent building in Mexico and Point South. And a lot of these folks at one time or another wound up in Philadelphia, where they wrote and published material. There's a lot of political tracts done, but also some literature. And I'm particularly interested in the literature that was done. I had a friend who did her PhD dissertation on this book at Harvard in the late 90s. So this has been on my radar for a long time, but it took me 25 years to find a copy. And I was finally offered one this spring out of Mexico. I'm going to show you the title page. As you'll see, it was printed in Philadelphia in 1826 by William Stavely. I find 3 things of particular interest on this title page. One is that it was done anonymously. Most of the scholarship on this book has been arguing about who wrote it or who didn't. There's been some recent scholarship that seems to have put that to rest. It was a Spaniard living in New York City who was listed as a distributor for this book who actually wrote it. Something else, you will see it says Tomo Primero, Volume 1. Well, I only found 1 out of 2 volumes. So I was, I did not reject this because I hadn't seen it. First one I'd seen in 25 years, I bought it. I've still got some collecting years in front of me. I figured a second one would come my way. So that didn't bother me. And then third, I'll show this again. I love written information from former owners. Here we have an apparent German-speaking former owner who's written Roman at the bottom, or novel. Well, some people might think that's kind of a silly thing to write at the bottom of the page of a novel, to say this is a novel, except that wasn't an idle comment. The earliest Latin American novel to have been published only came out 10 years before that, in 1816. And this, although it wasn't the first novel, is credited with being the first historical novel and the first indigenous novel out of Latin America. I just realized I did not tell you what the novel's about. It's about the conquest of Mexico from the point of view of the indigenous peoples, largely La Malinche, who was Cortes's companion and translator. So it's quite interesting in literary and historical perspective. So soon after getting Volume 1, lightning struck twice. Now, it would be too neat of a story to say this was the missing volume 2. No, this is another copy of volume 1, which, you know, how can you pass up even though you already have it? This one I like. It's in a more contemporary leather binding and boards. I can't say if it's original as issued yet because I haven't seen enough to compare it to. But it is nice. It's signed by a former owner, and it's a woman, Maria de la Luz Charles. Now, Maria de la Luz did not put any reading notes in the margins, which would have been wonderful, but I am happy that she put her name in there because we know that it was a woman who had this book and presumably read it. And that'll give me some fun in the future trying to track down more information about who she was and perhaps tracking down volume 2 of her copy of this book. So with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for reminding us, as many I'm sure are well aware in this group, collecting continues even as pandemics rage on around us. It's really wonderful to learn more about your adventures in this really fascinating collecting area. Again, just a reminder, questions in the chat box, and we will return to your questions and discussion points at the end of our program. Our next presenter is David Allen Richards, who is a retired Manhattan real estate attorney and a leading collector of Rudyard Kipling. His collection of 2,500 items was gifted to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, which occasioned the writing of a catalog titled Rudyard Kipling, The Books I Leave Behind. Richards is a member of bibliophilic organizations, including the Girl Year Club. Welcome, Mr. Richards, and thanks so much for joining us for this showcase today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, fellow collectors. I'm and different from those who are also presenting today, their wonderful stories, what rare book dealer Rick Jakowski calls a rare breed, a completist, interested in acquiring as many works and memorabilia as possible of one and only one author. Alex, would you put up the first image, please? For me, that one author is Rudyard Kipling. His life began in 1865 and lasted through 1936. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1907, the first given to an English language author. His first printed work was written at age 14. It appeared in a family magazine in 1879, put together by his cousins, of which the only examples are in the British Library. The last work published in his lifetime appeared in the Strand and Atlantic Monthly magazines in Great Britain and the United States, respectively. In January 1936, the very month of his death. My bibliography of Kipling, shown here, was published by the British Library and Open Old Press in 2010, and it's since been supplemented by a 40-page addendum, which is posted on the Open Old website, adding what I've discovered since 2010. The book records 483 A items, 132 B items with Kipling contributions, 17 BP items, which is prefaces, 130 BL items containing his private letters, C items, appearances in periodicals, 1,042 of them, D items, 28 sets of his collected works, the first appearing in America without his permission in 1890-91. And then 183 editions of Kipling works which are not first editions, but which the authors of 5 prior bibliographies of Kipling have listed, and that makes them collectible. And so I felt compelled to describe. Also cataloged are 14 plays based on his novels and stories, or written by him, unnumbered hundreds of musical settings of his verses, and some 30 motion pictures and animated features, the first filmed in 1910. Without counting the musical settings, that's 2,031 individual entries in this bibliography. Alex, could you do the next image, please? The bibliography grew out of my computer catalog, and as Dr. Ames mentioned, it's now in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, and it contains about 3,100 items now. And it includes a lot of different things. When you collect one author, there's a lot of spillover as the collecting urge outruns, if not the income, at least the ability to find things to buy. So it's a little hard to read, but very quickly, we have not only books and autographed manuscripts, but autographed letters by himself and his family, corrected page proofs, original drawings and book plates by Rudyard and his father John Lockwood Kipling, signed dinner menus, original magazines and newspapers, musical settings, formal portraits by camera or woodblock or lithograph, newspaper and other candid photographs, caricatures, book posters, movie posters and press kits and lobby cards, cigarette cards, commemorative medals, ships' passengers lists showing Kipling on board, postcards with Kipling connections, commemorative stamps from many nations, advertising ephemera, items crafted in silver, items of pottery decorated with the absent-minded baker, 45 of those to my wife's dismay while dusting them, including a 10-piece tea service, old 78 long-playing records of settings of his poems, modern CDs with readings of them by people like Ralph Fiennes, DVDs of the motion pictures, and auction sale and booksellers catalogs of Kipling sales, which began back in 1898 when he was only 33, some of which are themselves first editions of a Kipling verse or private letter or drawing. Like I said, I'm pleased. Today, I'm going to talk about two non-book items recently acquired during the pandemic. Virtually everything else is up at Yale, about each of which I've written an article appearing in the Kipling Journal. Could I have the next slide, Alex? The first is an autographed manuscript copy of Kipling's poem, Our Lady of the Snows. Now, before this example came to light, there were two other AMS known to exist. One's in the Stuart Kipling collection at Dalhousie University in Halifax, which is the home of the world's second largest Kipling collection. And another is in the collection of Kipling manuscripts presented by the author to Magdalen College, Cambridge, where he'd been elected an honorary fellow. The Dalhousie copy is dated 26 April 1897, with the address 7 Beacon Terrace, Torquay, along the Devon seacoast, known familiarly as the English Riviera. Kipling had left his first home in Brattleboro, Vermont, 8 months previously, and he'd rented a house near Torquay. He wrote a poem in spontaneous salute to the Dominion of Canada, the Our Lady of the Snows of the poem's title, for its having unexpectedly eliminated its tariff on imported goods from Great Britain while keeping it on other countries' goods. The verses were published in the Times in London on 27 April, the day after the date on the Dalhousie AMS, which was used by the Times for its printing. Could I have the next slide, Alex, please? My copy, as you see, is also dated April 9, 1897, and it's said to have come from a descendant of a Torquay schoolmaster, William Saul, who died in 1960 and came from one of his relatives. But he had more than 6 decades before met Kipling in 1896 on the local golf course. And while I cannot be absolutely certain it's the same man, I've managed to identify in the United Kingdom decennial census records a William Frederick James Saul, who in 1897 was just a few months younger than Kipling and was also the father of 2 young children like Rudyard. And I can be certain that the first golf course to be built on the south coast of England was established by members of the Royal Torbay Yacht Club in 1892, a 9-holer at Walls Hill, which is just 3 miles down the road from Kipling's rented house. Alex, the next slide, please. This is a woodblock by William Nicholson in the book he illustrated for Kipling's verses, published by Heinemann, titled An Almanac of 12 Sports, in which there are 12 plates, of which this is one. The book was published in November 1897, which was just 8 months after Kipling left Torquay forever. having apparently written the fair copy I've shown you as a favor for his golfing buddy. And while it may be coincidental, this is a picture of a golfer by the seaside at a course which must have looked very much like Kipling's and Saul's at Walls Hill in Torquay. The second recent acquisition which I want to share with you today is the sole surviving artifact of a wrench in Kipling's late career. The desecration and compelled disuse for almost half a century of what constituted one of his graphic trademarks, used on the uniform edition of his books in Great Britain, published by Macmillan, and those in the United States, published by Doubleday, the swastika. The first book of Kipling's bearing a swastika in its cover design appeared in the United States in 1897, when Adolf Hitler was only 8 years old. Next slide, please, Alex. Ironically, the very year that the Austrian schoolboy first viewed the symbol up on the walls of his Benedictine choir school at Lambic Abbey. And this is a courtyard wall decoration at the Abbey. Now, many of you may know that the swastika is a Hindu symbol of good luck or good fortune, and it's the mystic sign of the elephant-headed god Ganesh or Ganesha. It's placed over Hindu doorways and on the first page of Hindu ledgers and daybooks by merchants, so that the future economic year might be, quote, good to be. Ganesh was the son of Shiva, one of the main deities of Hinduism, and his image became popular because he was the first god invoked at the beginning of worship or of new enterprise, such as the sale of Rudyard's first books, paper collections of his short stories. Alex, next slide, please. This is the cover of one of the 6 Indian Railway Library titles which Kipling did. They were sold at Indian Railway newsagent stations, priced at ₹1 a copy. The series included Soldiers 3 and Wee Willie Winkie, as well as this one in black and white. And as a sort of running trademark for the covers designed by his father, there at the bottom you see varying images of Ganesh, the elephant head god, holding in its trunk a lotus, which is a flower sacred throughout the East. Next slide, please, Alex. In a later illustration by his father Lockwood for Annie Steele's Tales of the Punjab in 1894, he portrayed an elephant making obeisance to an Indian prince with the swastika on its headcloth. In time, Lockwood added to this combination of elephant head and lotus the third symbol, the swastika itself. Next slide, please, Alex. This is a bas-relief, which was done as a clay three-dimensional figure with the swastika added by Lockwood Kipling when his son asked him to design an ornament for his first collected edition, which was called the Outward Bound edition and began publication in the United States by Frank Doubleday in 1897. This is the plaster bas-relief of its design. The corresponding titles were published in Great Britain by Macmillan in its uniform edition beginning in 1899, again with the swastika-embellished Ganesh with his lotus. Alex, please, the next slide. This is the shot of one up on eBay, which strikes me or makes me nuts every time I see it, because folks who don't know this history always tend to advertise it as showing the, in this case, German party symbol 1901. You'll see there in the title. Usually they just use the word swastika. Now, Kipling, of course, was not the only one in these decades to employ the swastika as a branding symbol. Next slide, please, Alex. This is a Coca-Cola bottle opener. What could be more American than Coca-Cola? And then Adolf Hitler in 1920, as he recorded in Mein Kampf, chose the hooked cross, the Hakenkreuz, black on a white circle on a red background as the emblem of his new political party. Alex, next slide. German intellectuals of that era believed that the early Aryans of India were the prototypical white invaders and the cultural ancestors of the German people. Now, Kipling, as far back as January 1901, had sought and received a trademark for the use of the Ganesh from the U.S. Patent Office, where he described the elephant as, quote, having a lotus flower held by the trunk and also enclosed in a circular design with a representation of the swastika, close quote. The next year, in his Just So Stories of 1907, next slide please, Alex, which Rudyard himself illustrated, there is a swastika, you see it down there in the lower right, on the picture for the story, The Crab That Played with the Sea. But 20 years on, Kipling was keenly aware of and increasingly distressed by the Nazis' formal adoption of his long-used and beloved symbol. In October 1930, he filed a new trademark application with the British Patent Office. Next slide, Alex. As you can see, they still include the Ganesh, some include the lotus, but none include the swastika. Kipling had been among the first to warn loudly and publicly against the Nazi Party's rise to power, publishing front-page poems about it in newspapers as early as May 1932, while Winston Churchill was out of office and had made no parliamentary or BBC speeches warning his countrymen against the Nazis. On 29 May 1933, between publishing his Nazi Germany-inflected poems, The Storm Cone, about the storm that was to come, and Bonfires on the Ice, bonfires which fool us because they look warm, but they will fall through the ice. He published those in London's Morning Post. He, on 29 May 1933, instructed his literary agent A.S. Watt to direct his English publisher Macmillan and his American publisher Doubleday to remove the swastika from all of Kipling's future books appearing in both countries. Final slide, please, Alex. This is, so far as I know, the only surviving example of that printing block used for the front boards of the Macmillan and Doubleday editions. This, since it came from England, must be from the Macmillan edition. And you see that the swastika is a face. You see the slightly lighter rectangle up by the elephant's eye, the square where some workman has chiseled away the swastika so that the stamp can still be used. And that square is, of course, much brighter than the other surfaces of this very much used stamp. Kipling refused to explain his action to the press. But a couple of years later, and only 2 months before his death, he informed a correspondent on 28 December 1935 about this decision taken 2.5 years earlier. His trademark had been, quote, defiled beyond recognition. And the last 2 books he published, Souvenirs of France and his posthumously appearing memoir, Something of Myself, still featured the elephant grasping the lotus in his trunk. But the swastika was gone. Thank you for your attention. You can stop the share screen now, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. It's just so interesting to get this really detailed material culture informed, insight into symbols and how symbols meanings can change and evolve over time, and how Kipling was sort of caught up in the affairs of the 20th century. Really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. We are now going to move on to our final presenter as part of this showcase. Rebecca Romney is a bookseller, appraiser, and author. She is the co-founder of the rare book firm Type Punch Matrix and co-founder of the Honey and Wax Prize, an annual book collecting award for an American woman aged 30 or younger. Romney has appeared on the History Channel's show Pawn Stars as the rare books specialist since 2011. This summer, she is issuing a catalog of her collection on the romance novel in English. She is a member of the Grolier Club. Welcome, Ms. Romney, and thank you so much for being a part of our showcase today.
Thank you for having me. I just got to sit back and listen to all these great stories, and I hope that I can live up as the sort of final caboose here. As mentioned in the intro, as part of my work as a rare book dealer, I built a collection on the romance novel in English, which is now promised to an institution. And I started working on this because, well, first, I like the subject, and I think that's reason enough, as anyone here probably understands. But second, it was because I saw it as a major gap in the rare book world, and I decided I needed to turn my frustration about that into something productive and useful. And I'm going to share my screen here so you can see what's happening. And there we go. Okay, so very few institutional special collections have significant holdings in this field. Bowling Green University is actually the biggest exception, but there aren't that many others. Most of the collectors of this material too don't intersect with traditional rare book circles. And while there are collectors in this field, and there have been for many, many decades, they tend to stay in their own circles where their subject of interest isn't immediately greeted with incredulity or condescension. And most rare book dealers don't handle this material, or rather they tend to handle material that fits in this field more in pre-World War II, which is to say before the paperback revolution, and therefore also before one of the most vibrant, influential, and fascinating periods in the history of the genre, when romance began its climb to the top of publishing where it lives today. And it does live there. The genre of popular romance is the only billion-dollar industry in the modern publishing marketplace. It accounts for 1/4 of all fiction sales, and it earns more than double its nearest competitor, which is mystery, by the way. And although genre fiction as a whole is significantly less represented in institutional special collections than, say, literary fiction, even within genre fiction, romance is the least represented, while simultaneously claiming the most readers and the most revenue of them all. Why is this? Now feels like a good time to make another observation. Romance has largely been authored by women writers, focused on women's perspectives, and marketed to women readers. And this trait has far-reaching implications across editorial philosophies, distribution strategies, reader reception, and its place in the world of book collecting. But because the genre is so dynamic, and it really is dynamic, it's undergone dramatic evolution over the centuries, and it has a long established track record of nimble responses to current events. This dynamism actually makes it a great place to dig into subjects related to book history. So as an example, on the left, this is the first appearance of a complete romance novel. It was issued as the special Saturday edition of the Toronto Star Weekly in March of 1953. So the strategy of publishing entire English novels in the form of newspapers goes back at least as far as the 1830s. US publishers at that time were reacting to an economic depression, in part by publishing what they called weeklies, novels printed on huge folio sheets that could be distributed through the post at cheaper newspaper rates and used far cheaper materials than typical books. Many romances were first published in ephemeral form similar to this, but unless they were written by an especially popular author, they often didn't make it into book form at all. And so there is an entire lost literature of romances that lived only in these ephemeral publications. By the 1950s, this kind of publication was still quite common, and you can see here. And in fact, many publishing houses would keep a close eye on the weeklies in order to find new novels that they could bring out in book form. Covert's novel here, this was actually picked up immediately by Avalon in New York. It was published as a hardcover in the same year. And it was popular enough to be chosen for printing again as part of Bantam's Red Road series in 1971, which is what you see on the right. So together, these two versions of the same book demonstrate how format is directly tied to publisher approach and to target audience. This next example, these three books are from Avalon's series of hardcover medical romances. These were advertised to last with their original Brodart plastic clear jacket covers. These covers are an early version of the archival plastic jacket sleeves now that we all recognize on collectible books. And they speak to Avalon's branding strategy for selling popular fiction in hardcover. This was, by the way, not just romance, but also mystery and science fiction. They were encouraging buyers to think of these lines as longer term additions to their library and not read and toss mass market paperbacks. Ironically, these early word art covers also included these reinforced edges. You can see where the plastic was taped to the lifetime registered trademark backing paper. And this combination of factors often led to the edges sticking to the jacket of the book. So many copies with these covers, they have these spots of black stickiness. It kind of has the feel of electrical tape, the residue from electrical tape. And so these Avalon hardcovers are a study in made to last branding combined with poor quality manufacturing that resulted in just the opposite. And these examples so far, you can find examples of them in other genres. Avalon, as I said, did science fiction and mystery, and those weeklies obviously were across the genre in popular fiction. But those are warm-ups, okay? Let's give you some examples that are more romance specific. On the left here, these are 3 Harlequin romances translated into 3 different languages, Dutch, French, and Japanese. In the 70s, 1974, Harlequin was beginning to expand outside of English language markets. And in this expansion, they typically chose to reproduce their North American market tested format for most of these projects. And while the exact details might differ depending on location, you can see they're issued in the same size, they have the same glossy white wrappers, they have that color pictorial vignette on the bottom half. The notable exception in this era is the German translations, which you see in the middle here, the Julia ones, because these were using the already successful magazine-like format that had been established in the distribution network of the publisher that they were partnering with in Germany. So they're like, well, if it isn't broke, we're not going to fix it. We'll just do what you do. But otherwise, they were like, we know what works, so we're going to keep doing what works in these other countries. And as you can see with the Japanese example, Harlequin initially followed that strategy of producing what works already in Japan, but later found more success using the country's format of choice for the genre, which is manga, which is what you see on the far right there. So when you follow Harlequin across markets, you can see what assumptions they're making about those markets and how they're adapting to existing conventions or choosing to rely on their own. Next, these books were all published by Playboy, actually. Playboy, surprise. Playboy saw an opportunity in the erotic historical market that blossomed in the US in the 1970s, where all these really sensual romances set in the past were becoming incredibly popular, selling millions of copies. And you can see too, there's no trademark bunny logo. They decided that that was too associated with the male gaze, and they decided they needed a totally different logo for this production. And you can also see an evolution of their cover designs. Proud Passion was their first book. Ravaged Heart came out a little bit later, and Bride of Fury is actually a very famous cover design. And it shows the classic, what we call the clinch, which is that central embrace. And so what you're seeing here is this evolution of Playboy kind of catching on to this particular marketplace. It's still that Playboy sensuality and sexiness, but with an entirely different aesthetic, because they're conveying it to an entirely different audience. And though these cover styles have long fallen out of fashion, they've made a longer lasting contribution to the evolution of codes of romance cover design. Scholar Anne Goris explores this concept in romance at length in her article, Hidden Codes of Love, the Materiality of the Category Romance Novel. It's a great article if you're interested in this. She uses book historical methods to tease out the implications of in-group and out-group reactions to the very same cover designs. For instance, where a non-romance reader sees dozens of covers that read all the same because they feature that clinch, that sort of central embrace, the romance reader notes details like how much skin is showing, how much space is kept between the couple. And you can infer the level of heat in the individual book from those cues. And you can also distinguish among subgenres. So on the far left, the Circle of Love, that's a very conservative line. In the middle, The Ghost of a Chance That Every Key, there's a Harlequin Temptation, which was considered an incredibly sexy line. That's not obvious. And then on the right, you're seeing the award winners for the first group of awards given by the Romance Writers Association of America. So this is, you can see these are actually each different categories, historicals and contemporaries, et cetera. So actually incredibly different to a romance reader, even though you might look at them and think that they look similar to you. And one of the myths of modern romance collecting is that this material is common and easy to obtain. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen these across the board on eBay or wherever you end up looking, or you grew up seeing them in supermarkets. But the volume of the books available on the secondhand market belies the fundamental scarcity of individual titles, especially in the first printing and in decent condition. For example, when Harlequin became convinced of the potential in Mills and Boon's medical romances, Mills and Boon was the UK publisher based in London, it issued a 7,500 copy print runs, which is not particularly a small amount. But before it committed, Harlequin printed a trial run of only 1,000 copies of two test titles, Hospital Mbawambo and Hospital Corridors. And these books are now rare in the first printing and especially in nice condition. And even obtaining more recent material can often lead to challenges, both due to scarcity in the first printing and in how the current secondhand market functions. So the collector can really run up against a lot of unexpected obstacles. And this can even apply to books that some of you are used to, again, thinking are common, easy to obtain, like the scholastic line, YA line of romances, Wildfire, that started in 1979. Again, these just seem so unremarkable, but I have to tell you, I looked so hard for these books. They are so hard to find in the first printing in good condition. The bibliographic resources currently available for these books are incredibly garbled. The titles are misattributed, the places in this series, like what number they are, their dates of publication, it's all a mess. And they are objectively scarce in this condition. And again, the first printing thing is important because very few online sellers, they include images for these books. Those that do rarely include any information or pictures that verify the printing. And so in this, frankly, they exemplify one of the most common problems for any collector across the board, which is that reading copies are abundant, but first printings in collectible condition are not. And this principle is acknowledged and reflected in how dealers handle many kinds of material. Romance is a major exception, though. Sellers on the secondhand market currently make very few such distinctions in their romance listings. Next is an example that speaks both to the incredible potential in romance collecting and the ongoing loss of great material simply because its historical interest has not yet been recognized. What you're seeing here is a group of collections specially gathered and organized by a single romance reader who actively participated in the genre's fandom circles over the course of nearly 3 decades. And as you can see, the star of the collection is the huge amount of promotional ephemera that she particularly sought. But when I got it incomplete. I was offered it by a scout. He had found 5 binders at a thrift shop, no more, only 5 binders. And each binder is organized by a letter of the alphabet. So D includes, Janet Dailey material, for example. Presumably, therefore, there were more binders to cover the entire alphabet. So it is excruciating to think about the years of dedicated work this collector put into her project, only to have it broken apart and the majority of it most likely thrown away. Would this have happened if romance had a better reputation for its collecting potential? Well, maybe. But the scenario may have played out very differently if the person who dispersed the collection knew that dealers and special collection libraries actively sought rare and unusual material. A collection like this, too, is a treasure trove for research, but there are as yet very few opportunities within institutions to study material like it. I'm going to give you a specific example that came from this collection. So to date, I haven't found a single reference in any scholarship to Tango 2, which was, as far as I can tell, the earliest US romance line dedicated to Latino romances. Tango 2 was published by Genesis Press, which is a Mississippi-based Black-owned small press publisher. And as a small press, its footprint has not been as readily visible as that of major presses like Kensington, whose line Encanto, which you can see on the right hand there, began a year after Tango 2 and has often been credited in the past as the first Latino romance line in the United States. And so guess how I found out about Tango 2? An ephemeral notice from Genesis Press among the hundreds of other items in that collection of promotional materials. And before this point, I had no idea it existed at all. I didn't know to look for it, right? But now that I knew, I could start hunting down those titles. And so it was only in the process of collecting that I learned enough to get an idea of where to begin tugging, not through any established research or documentation. So it was the process of collecting itself that opened up a new path. So collecting to me is not just acquisition, collecting is discovery. Another example of this is Ebony Snow's first book, Chic Spell. This book was published once again by a Black-owned independent press, Odyssey Press. I found it because I had taken a particular interest in Odyssey Press. It was established by a woman named Letitia Peoples in Silver Spring, which is where my offices are. So when I found Chic Spell, I wasn't looking for it in particular. I was looking for Odyssey Press romances in general. And when I found this book, I did a double take at the publication date, 1992. And the reason this surprised me is because of my academic reading. In fact, it was because of one of my favorite works in modern romance scholarship, a book, Shuming Teo's Desert Passions, Orientalism in Romance Novels. So in this book, Teo very clearly states that the first chic romance with an African-American woman did not appear until 2002. Yet this small press book with an African-American scientist heroine was a decade earlier. And this is not to denigrate Teo's research. In fact, it's kind of to suggest just the opposite, that scholars doing brilliant work like Teo rely on what's available and accessible for them to study, and this book wasn't. And this gets to one of the things that I most value about the act of collecting. When we're talking about examples like these last two, the Latino and Black romances here in particular, but also broader communities of marginalized or underrepresented creators and readers. These are the narratives that are most likely to get buried in the official documents and the grand histories and the publisher's anniversary fetes. Collecting is a strategy to search beyond the dominant narratives, and even, or maybe especially, when you're not even entirely sure what you're looking for. And this is a critical role that we can offer as collectors, to uncover these narratives by finding the material that has been buried. The collection itself is already committed to an institution. If you'd like to see more examples from it, the catalog's available for free online and pre-order for a hardcover copy. And I hope that if you're interested, you will take a look, because the thing about romance is that there is so much potential for more discoveries like this, because there is so much that has not yet been tackled in romance collecting and romance history. I personally think this is really exciting, and romance scholarship has been gaining more and more momentum over the past few decades. And it's my opinion that how special collections and the larger rare books community respond to this will play a large role in how that scholarship continues to develop. And that's the end of my talk.
Rebecca Romney, thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation, which is both exciting and also a little terrifying to think of histories and narratives that are lost because they are not necessarily yet valued. So a wonderful note to end on, thinking about the vital role that collectors and collections play in shaping our cultural narratives. So much to think about here moving forward. So that brings us to the end of our formal program. I see it's already, let's see here, 5:41 Eastern time. Our presenters have kindly agreed to stick around and answer some questions. What I would like to propose we do is I will pose one question to each of the panelists. I well understand that some of you in the audience may well have to depart for other obligations, but you are invited to stay. I see that we have some questions rolling in, so I'm going to start working through some of them and pose questions to our panelists. But first, I will say again, thank you all so much. This has been a really fascinating set of talks today, and so vital for our current social, political, and cultural moment in which we find ourselves. Okay, so the first question that I will pose is for Jesse. Was Jesse Erickson, was Ouida translated, and do you collect translations? And if I may ask a second question, what's your favorite magazine appearance of Ouida?
That's a great question. Yeah, I focus a lot of attention on translations, although they're particularly hard for me to acquire because I have to buy them from other countries, and as of late, the U.S. Postal Service isn't what it used to be. And so I find myself every time I order internationally, I'm on pins and needles wondering if the book is inevitably going to arrive. I've already had like 2 or 3 circumstances where the book actually never showed up. So it's quite depressing when that happens. But yes, I do collect translations, mostly Japanese and Korean translations of A Dog of Flanders, which are contemporary in nature. I have like a manga version of A Dog of Flanders that I'm really excited about that I acquired recently. But she's been translated in French, Italian, German, Austrian, and some of the Eastern European languages as well. So, I'm very much interested in translations. In terms of your second question, my favorite magazine appearance, I have a lot, but I think that Ouida on the Art of Dress in Cosmopolitan, it's a September 1897 issue of Cosmo, where she, waxes poetically on fashion and how she, envisions how the ideal form of fashion should be. I consider myself sort of a Black dandy myself, so I'm very much interested in the topic of fashion. And it's really interesting and she also in her book, she really pays close attention on the dressing styles of her characters and narrates their attire to an excruciating detail oftentimes. And so it's really interesting to see her viewpoints on what she thinks is fashionable and what she doesn't. And so I really enjoyed that article. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much. And our next question is for Victoria Dailey. And this is a nice, succinctly stated question. Was the actress equals prostitute equation also true in early 19th century California? Victoria, you are muted.
The answer is yes, but in a very different way, because in Paris and France, the whole culture was built around prostitution. I mean, the whole women's lives were based around what they could and couldn't do, and therefore prostitution played a major role. In California, of course, there was prostitution. There's prostitution everywhere, but it didn't have the same regimented and societal impact that it had in Paris. I mean, there were prostitutes here, and I do collect that as well, especially in San Francisco. But the tone and the tenor, the documentation is completely different. There was no real analysis as there was in France. I mean, the French are so good at analyzing and categorizing everything. But here, yeah, there was prostitution, and I have some information on it. But before I leave on that note, I wanted to show Rebecca two things in my collection. I think it's nice the way our collecting interests can tie up, and I agree with her completely that I've learned through collecting, you keep going down new rabbit holes and getting new information. But I don't know if you can see these two books. Can you see them? Let's see. Well, one is the paperback version of 77 Sunset Strip, which was a popular TV series, and it's important for Los Angeles history in a certain way. And the other is a sensationalized looking book by Horace McCoy, who is a noted Hollywood writer who also wrote They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And his things were turned into a lot of movies. So I just wanted to express solidarity.
Thank you so much. Our next question is for Bill Fisher. Were the images in the photo book chosen by Neruda to go with his poems?
That's a very good question. Neruda was particularly interested in the physical production of his work. He was a bibliophile himself. He collected a lot of authors, and he paid more attention than many to the design of his own books. In fact, even as a very young author, his claim to fame came in 24 when he published 20 love songs and 20 love poems and a desperate song. He almost lost his publishing contract by insisting that it be published in square format with very wide margins. And the publisher said no on economic grounds because that was going to waste a lot of paper. But he insisted and enlisted some friends to advocate on his behalf. So it was done that way. And in fact, that created a vogue in the style of publishing poetry books in Chile in the 20s and 30s. Lots of them came out in this square or oblong format with wide margins. That being said, in this particular case, the photo montages were solely the work of Pedro Olmos, who was the designer. He is credited on that page I showed that had the details about the edition and the machine stamping of it. It said that the composition of the montages and their disposition within the book were the work of Pedro Olmos. He was a Chilean graphic designer. He did a lot of work with other Chilean books at the time, and I've got a nice little almost collection. And then got into oil painting later in life. So that's the answer to that question.
Thank you. Next question is for Dave Richards. Could you say a bit more about how Kipling got involved in writing films?
Well, Hollywood sought him out as far back as the Silence, and he tried his hand at plays. So dramatic depictions were not alien to him. He didn't have much more luck than Henry James did on the stage with his plays, and he did not write film scripts. Today we really only know him as being played by other people like Christopher Plummer in The Man Who Would Be King, where Kipling himself is a character. But there have probably been 55 or 60 movies, and it was an art in which he was interested from the silent era. But it was because he was such a popular writer that the British film industry and then Hollywood sought him out.
Thank you so much. And our final question for this showcase goes to our final presenter, Rebecca Romney. Rebecca, can you say something about the representation of race on the covers of romance novels? Specifically, I am wondering how often different races appear on the covers of general audience novels, not just those intended for Latinx or Black readers.
I am super happy that this is the question, because obviously we didn't have a lot of time to get into the sort of varieties that you see in romance, but also one of the big things that you cannot ignore with the history of English language romance, especially in the 20th century, is how I talk about it being centered on women readers. For a lot of that, it's centered on straight women readers, or straight white women readers. And what that means is that for a large part of the history, you're looking at white characters and white authors. And even when you have Black authors who are participating in this environment, they're often told that they need to make their characters white, with the argument that that is the audience. And it's very clear that the creation of these independent Black-owned presses, specifically to meet a market need of Black romances, for example, that market need was not being met by larger publishers. So these independent presses took it upon themselves to meet that need. And so you do see examples here and there, but you don't really start to see more. You get a little bit more in the 1980s, in the 1990s when it really starts rolling. Today, it's a completely different story because self-publishing and ebook publishing really changes the sort of power dynamic in terms of who gets to gatekeep and decide what gets published. But over a lot of the history of 20th century romance, it is aimed towards white women, and that really affects who the characters are and how they're being portrayed.
Thank you for that context. And with that, I'm going to conclude this showcase. I again want to thank all of our distinguished presenters for being a part of this wonderful event today. I mean, I was so excited about this program. I know many of you were as well, and it has vastly exceeded even my expectations with these really interesting synergies that we see in terms of the work of collectors and collections, pushing our understandings in new directions by means of these primary sources. And as someone who works at a library and does scholarship, I mean, it's so important to hear these voices from the front lines of truly changing our understandings of the historical and cultural record. I will say, if anyone has any other questions that we did not get a chance to answer, if you have follow-up comments, discussion points, you all have my email address from when you registered for this event. So if you want other questions passed along to any of our presenters, please feel free to email me and I will make sure that those get passed along. If we do end up posting this online at some point, I will be sure to email you the link as well. So please be on the lookout for other FABS public programs to be sponsored in the future. If you have thoughts and comments on what more FABS can do to facilitate your bookish interests, please do not hesitate to be in touch. And I wish you all a hearty thank you for being a part of this program, and a pleasant rest of your weekend. Thanks again, everyone, and I hope to see you again very soon. Good night.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.